America, 2025. A nation standing at the edge of a political battlefield. With President Donald Trump back in the White House for a second term, Washington was in a state of upheaval. The streets of D.C. buzzed with the energy of a country split down the middle, one half celebrating a triumphant return, the other half mourning what they called the death of democracy. But beneath the headlines, behind the podiums, and away from the cameras, something far more insidious was at play. The so-called progressive movement, once roaring with self-righteous fervor, was crumbling under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The party that had spent years shouting about accountability, integrity, and justice was now being exposed, one scandal at a time. And at the center of it all stood a name that had become both an icon and a cautionary tale. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. For years, AOC had been the poster child of the radical left, a fearless crusader, a firebrand who built her career on speeches about fairness and equality. But the tide was turning. The whispers had started, the kind of whispers that ruined careers, the kind that could bring down an empire. And there was one man who knew how to listen. Logan Shaw didn't chase headlines, he created them. A veteran investigative journalist at the New York Sentinel, he had built his reputation on exposing the untouchable. He had taken down corrupt senators, unearthed billion-dollar fraud schemes, and survived more threats than he cared to count. In Washington, the truth wasn't just buried, it was actively suffocated. But Shaw had a habit of digging deep enough to make sure it saw the light of day. Still, even for him, this one was different. It started with an email, no sender, no subject, just a plain text message with an attachment. A folder labeled AOC and a single ominous sentence: "Find Miguel Torres before it's too late." Shaw leaned back in his chair, his instincts kicking in like a reflex. Miguel Torres. The name didn't immediately register, but what did was the document attached. A few keystrokes later, his screen was filled with something that could set Capitol Hill on fire. AOC, the same congresswoman who never missed a chance to lecture Americans on the importance of law and order, had allegedly hired an illegal immigrant as her campaign's chief of staff, paying him a generous $80,000 a year. Shaw let out a whistle. Well, he muttered, rubbing his jaw. Looks like somebody's been playing by their own set of rules. This wasn't just a scandal, it was political dynamite. AOC, the so-called champion of justice, had, if this document was real, not only violated federal law but had done so while standing on her moral high ground, preaching about ethics and accountability. The hypocrisy was staggering. But Shaw knew better than to take things at face value. Washington was a cesspool of misinformation, and he'd learned the hard way that a well-placed lie could do just as much damage as the truth. If this was real, if AOC had truly committed one of the most brazen violations of federal law as a sitting congresswoman, then the fallout would be seismic. There was only one way to find out: find Miguel Torres. Whoever sent that email knew something, and Shaw wasn't about to let the biggest story of the year slip through his fingers. His knuckles clicked open a new browser tab, and he started digging. Washington was about to get very, very messy. Logan Shaw had been in the game long enough to know when people were scared. Real fear wasn't loud. It didn't come in angry denials or dramatic outbursts. It came in silence, in the way people avoided eye contact, in the hesitant pauses before answering a simple question, in the way their hands gripped their coffee cups just a little too tightly. And right now, every single former staffer of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was terrified. Shaw had spent the last 24 hours making calls, chasing leads, and knocking on doors. Nothing. Most either refused to speak or claimed to know nothing, a phrase that, in Washington, usually meant they knew far too much. The first call had been to Daniel Green, a low-level campaign aide who had once been active on AOC's digital strategy team. The guy had picked up after the second ring, but the moment Shaw mentioned Miguel Torres' name, the line had gone dead. That was the pattern. The moment Torres came up, people shut down. It wasn't just avoidance, it was calculated fear. Shaw sat at the counter of a quiet Georgetown cafe, flipping through his notes. Every scandal had a pattern, a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to the truth. Right now, the pattern was clear. Miguel Torres had been an essential piece of AOC's operation, and the moment things shifted politically, he had vanished into thin air. That wasn't coincidence, that was deliberate. And then, finally, a break. A new message pinged into his encrypted inbox. No sender, no signature, just a single line. Miguel left the country the night Trump won. Bogota. Shaw exhaled slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, well," he murmured, shutting his notebook. "Colombia it is." He pulled out his phone and began making arrangements. If Miguel Torres was hiding, it was because someone didn't want him talking, and Logan Shaw wasn't in the habit of letting people disappear. Washington, D.C. was a city built on facades, marble pillars and grand speeches, all meant to hide the rot beneath. It was a place where the truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And Logan Shaw had just stepped into a storm that smelled like a full-scale cover-up. Sitting in the dim glow of his office, he tapped his finger against the desk, staring at the last message he'd received. Miguel left the country the night Trump won. Bogota. The pieces were starting to fit together. Miguel Torres, former Deputy Communications Director for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a man with intimate knowledge of her campaign's inner workings, hadn't just left. He had fled. Which meant one thing: someone wanted him gone. And now, someone wanted Shaw to stop looking for him. He picked up his phone and tried AOC's press office one more time, straight to voicemail. Again. Not that he expected anything different. When you're caught with both hands in the cookie jar, the last thing you do is answer the phone. Then, just as he was about to draft an email, a news alert flashed across his screen. Breaking, AOC. Shaw clicked the link, the grainy live stream buffering before AOC's face filled the screen. Hair perfectly styled, expression sculpted into the righteous indignation of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of victimhood. "This is nothing more than a clerical error," she said, her voice laced with just the right amount of exasperation. "A simple miscommunication that's being twisted into something sinister by right-wing extremists." A clerical error? Shaw exhaled a quiet laugh. Right, and the Titanic had a minor navigation issue. This was Washington Damage Control 101. First, deny everything. Second, frame yourself as the victim. Third, turn the narrative against your accusers. And just like that, CNN, MSNBC, and the usual suspects jumped in to clean up the mess. AOC targeted in politically motivated smear campaign. Right-wing media exploits minor bureaucratic oversight to attack progressive leader. It was orchestrated, and Shaw knew it. But what AOC didn't know, what her entire PR team hadn't accounted for, was that the lie was already unraveling. Because just as the press conference wrapped up, Shaw's phone buzzed. A new anonymous delivery had just arrived at his office. He retrieved the package himself, glancing around for anything suspicious before tearing open the plain brown envelope. Inside, he found exactly what he expected: the truth. A signed employment contract proving Miguel Torres had been on AOC's payroll, earning a cushy $80,000 a year. A leaked email exchange from her own senior staff explicitly warning that hiring an undocumented immigrant was a direct violation of federal law. And AOC's own response to that warning: "We'll handle it. No one will find out." Shaw let out a low whistle. So much for a clerical error, she knew. She had always known. This wasn't just political negligence. It was deliberate, calculated deception. And if there was one thing Shaw had learned over the years, it was that a cover-up was always worse than the crime itself. This was only getting started. Now the real question was, who else was in on it? The package had changed everything. Logan Shaw sat in his office, the dim light of his desk lamp casting shadows over the documents spread before him. A signed contract, a damning email, the undeniable proof that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had not only hired an illegal immigrant but had done so despite repeated warnings from her own team. It was the kind of story that could shake Washington to its core, if the right people were willing to listen. But something didn't sit right. Miguel Torres hadn't just left the country, he had disappeared. And people only disappeared for two reasons. Either they were running, or someone was making sure they stayed gone. That thought lingered in Shaw's mind as he boarded the overnight flight to Bogota. The moment he landed, the reality of the situation became clear. The heat of the city pressed against him as he stepped outside El Dorado International Airport, scanning the unfamiliar streets. Bogota had a reputation, a place where people came to start over, to hide, to escape whatever ghosts haunted them. And Miguel Torres? He was running from something much bigger. Shaw barely had time to hail a cab before his phone vibrated in his pocket. New message, no sender, no signature, just 6 words: "Get out. Stop looking for Miguel." Shaw stared at the screen for a moment, then let out a slow, amused exhale. So, that was how this was going to go. Washington may have been a city built on deception, but Bogota was where people went when they didn't want to be found. And yet, Logan Shaw had never been particularly good at taking a hint. No official records, no clear paper trail, just whispers in dark alleys, hesitant glances from bar owners, and phone numbers that led to dead ends. It was the kind of secrecy that didn't happen by accident. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury him. It took 2 days of chasing ghosts, cashing in favors, and wading through half-truths before he finally got a lead. A name scrawled onto a napkin, passed to him by a bartender who didn't ask questions: Barrio Santa Fe. By the time Shaw reached the apartment, the sun was sinking behind the skyline, casting the slums in long, uneven shadows. The building was falling apart, peeling paint, rusted window grates, a place meant for people who didn't want to be found. He knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Miguel Torres stood before him, a man who had once been a rising political operative, now reduced to the hollow-eyed look of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You shouldn't be here," Miguel whispered, darting a glance past Shaw's shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be watching. Shaw pushed his way inside, shutting the door behind him. The apartment was almost eerily empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just a half-packed suitcase sitting in the corner, as if Miguel was ready to vanish again at a moment's notice. "I need the truth," Shaw said, his voice even. "Not the press conference version, the real one." Miguel hesitated, then, at last, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "AOC knew," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knew I was undocumented. She hired me anyway, because I was loyal. Because I'd do whatever she asked." Shaw's jaw tightened. "And the paperwork? Fake." Miguel swallowed hard. The contract, the social security number, the payroll system, all of it was rigged by her team. A few close insiders made sure I looked clean on paper. It was worse than Shaw had imagined. This wasn't just a mistake, it was systematic fraud. "After Trump won," Miguel continued, his voice quieter now, "she told me to lay low. She even..." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear. "Even what?" Shaw pressed. Miguel exhaled shakily. "She gave me instructions, how to avoid ICE, how to disappear. She helped me get out." Shaw's breath stilled. This wasn't just an employment scandal. This was collusion. Conspiracy. A sitting congresswoman actively working against federal law. And Miguel Torres? He was the proof. But proof was meaningless if Miguel didn't live long enough to tell his story. And from the way he kept glancing toward the window, Shaw wasn't sure he would. The only one who knew that. Miguel hesitated before reaching into the pocket of his worn-out jacket. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out a cheap, battered USB drive, the kind you'd expect to find at a gas station checkout, not in the hands of a man carrying evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful politicians in the country. Shaw took it carefully, weighing its significance in his palm. "What's on it?" he asked, already knowing that whatever it was, it would change everything. Miguel exhaled sharply. "A meeting," he said. "One that wasn't supposed to be recorded." Shaw didn't need to be told twice. He pulled out his laptop, inserted the drive, and waited. The screen flickered for a moment before grainy footage filled the frame. It was a private strategy session, somewhere deep inside AOC's campaign headquarters. The camera, likely hidden behind a stack of policy binders, captured a small, exclusive group of senior aides and advisors huddled around a table. And at the center of it all, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was mid-sentence when the audio kicked in. "We have to be smart about this," she said, her voice firm. "The administration is tightening its grip. If ICE steps up enforcement, some of our people are going to get caught in the net." A pause. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. "We can't afford that kind of exposure," another voice chimed in. AOC leaned forward, her hands clasped together like she was orchestrating a chess game where every piece was a federal crime waiting to happen. "We make sure it doesn't happen," she said. "We give them what they need to stay off the radar: legal resources, safe housing, transit options. We keep them moving." Shaw's stomach tightened. This wasn't just talking points. This wasn't empty rhetoric. This was active coordination to subvert federal immigration law. Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper. She called it the Protection Network. Shaw didn't look away from the screen. He didn't need to. The weight of what he had just heard was already settling in. This wasn't a slip-up. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was premeditated, intentional, and undeniable. And if the world saw this, AOC's career wouldn't just end, it would go up in flames. Logan Shaw had never been the kind of journalist to sit on a nuclear bomb and wait for permission to drop it. And make no mistake, this was a nuclear bomb. Back in the States, sitting in his dimly lit apartment in D.C., he replayed the footage one last time. The grainy image of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seated at a table, not just breaking federal law but strategizing on how to keep doing it, flickered across his laptop screen. AOC wasn't just complicit. She was the architect of an underground network designed to help illegal immigrants evade federal authorities. And yet, somehow, CNN still had time for another segment on Trump's golf schedule. Shaw exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew exactly how this would go. The mainstream media wasn't going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And sure enough, the moment he reached out to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and MSNBC, the responses were almost laughable in their uniformity. Unverified footage, selective editing, lacks credibility. Editing baseless accusations. Oh, but when it was a rumor about Trump's tax returns, suddenly unnamed sources and anonymous leaks were the holy grail of journalism. Shaw had expected this. Hell, he'd counted on it. Because there was one thing legacy media had never learned. You can't silence the internet. He cracked his knuckles, logged into an encrypted server, and hit upload. Within minutes, the video was live. Twitter, Rumble, Truth Social, and every other platform where corporate censorship hadn't yet wrapped its tentacles around free speech. The reaction was explosive. AOC caught on tape illegally aiding migrants to evade ICE. The biggest scandal of AOC's career. Will she resign? Breaking. Federal crime. Leaked video shows AOC organizing illegal protection network. Within an hour, the clip had racked up millions of views. Within 3 hours, it was the #1 trending topic in the country. And within 6 hours, the political war had officially begun. Ted Cruz had been waiting for something like this. Sitting in his Senate office, the Texas firebrand scrolled through his phone, watching the AOC video spread like wildfire across conservative media. A slow smile tugged at his lips. He had spent years battling Ocasio-Cortez in the political arena, watching as she paraded around Capitol Hill, lecturing America on law, order, and justice, all while playing by her own set of rules. But now she'd been caught, and this time, not even her beloved activist press could protect her. Cruz stood, adjusted his tie, and walked straight into the lion's den, the Senate floor. When the cameras started rolling, he didn't waste a second. "I rise today to address something that should concern every single American." His voice was firm, calculated. The shocking and indisputable proof that a sitting member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has knowingly and willfully violated federal law. The chamber fell silent. The footage is clear. The words came from her own mouth. This is not speculation. This is not a right-wing conspiracy. This is reality. A pause. He let the weight of it settle. She hired an illegal immigrant. She paid him $80,000 a year. And when her own team warned her about the legal consequences, she ignored them. Why? Cruz leaned forward. Because she believes the law doesn't apply to her. Across the aisle, the Democrats were seething. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided eye contact. They knew he was right. And let's not forget, this is the same congresswoman who has spent years preaching about holding the powerful accountable. He let out a dry chuckle. Well, I say it's time we take her advice. A wave of conservative voices erupted behind him. The headlines were already forming. Ted Cruz demands investigation into AOC scandal. GOP senators push for action after damning video surfaces. But Cruz wasn't finished. He turned to the cameras, addressing the millions watching at home. If a Republican had been caught on tape breaking federal law, what do you think would happen? Would the New York Times ignore it? Would CNN pretend it wasn't newsworthy? He shook his head. No. There would be calls for resignation, arrest, impeachment. The outrage would be endless. Another pause. But when it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, suddenly it's a clerical error. Suddenly it's taken out of context. His voice sharpened. "Well, enough is enough." And then came the hammer. "I am officially calling for a full congressional investigation into Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez illegal activities, and I urge the Department of Justice to take immediate action. No member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, is above the law." The chamber exploded. Democrats were scrambling. Progressive activists were already losing their minds on Twitter. And conservative media. They had just been handed the biggest political gift of the year. Fox News, Breitbart, The Daily Wire, they were all over it. "This isn't a smear campaign. This is the truth," Tucker Carlson declared that night. "And if the DOJ doesn't act, it will prove what we've always known, that the system is rigged to protect the elites." Ben Shapiro didn't hold back either. "She's caught red-handed, no spin, no excuses. This is corruption at its finest. If she isn't investigated, it's because the people in power are just as guilty as she is." Meanwhile, on Truth Social, Donald Trump couldn't resist weighing in. "AOC caught committing crimes. Biggest hypocrite in Congress. When will the FBI raid her house like they did to me?" In less than 24 hours, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had gone from the darling of the progressive movement to the biggest political liability in Washington. And Logan Shaw? He wasn't done yet. Because if there was one thing he had learned in this business, it was that the fall was always the most interesting part of the story. Logan Shaw had seen political collapses before. Some happened like an avalanche, fast, loud, and brutal. Others, like this one, were slower, more insidious. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't done fighting, not yet. But Shaw knew the real danger wasn't the scandal itself, it was what happened next. When the first line of defense crumbled, politicians like AOC did what they always did, they doubled down. And sure enough, within 24 hours, the press conference was set. She wasn't going to explain. She wasn't going to admit to anything. She was going to go to war. Shaw sat back in his chair, watching the live stream as she took the podium, her expression carefully composed, the corners of her mouth just tight enough to suggest frustration but not fear. "I refuse to sit back and allow my name to be dragged through the mud by a known liar and right-wing extremist operative," she declared, eyes locked on the cameras. Shaw exhaled slowly. There it was, step one, attack the messenger. The thing about politicians? They never argued the facts, only the people exposing them. AOC wasn't talking about the video itself, the one where she openly discussed evading federal immigration laws. She wasn't addressing the damning emails or the leaked documents. She was making this about him. "Logan Shaw is not a journalist," she continued, her voice rising with carefully measured indignation. "He is a known associate of extremist networks that peddle misinformation and conspiracy theories." Shaw snorted. Cute. If she had bothered to check his record, she'd know he had exposed corruption on both sides of the aisle. But this wasn't about facts, it was about reframing the conversation. And the media, oh, they were all too happy to fall in line. By the time she finished, CNN and MSNBC were already running with it. AOC fights back against right-wing smear campaign. Far-right operative spreads disinformation to attack progressive leader. But there was one little problem. The evidence wasn't fake, and no amount of indignant monologues was going to make it go away. The cracks started subtly at first. Twitter activists rallied, hashtags trended, and her usual army of defenders did their best to shift the narrative. But something was off. Shaw recognized it almost instantly. Where were the big guns? Where was Nancy Pelosi? Where was Chuck Schumer? The establishment wasn't rushing to her defense. Instead, they were waiting, watching, calculating. And then, like clockwork, the real shift began. Politico dropped an anonymous insider piece, DC Code 4, "We're seeing if we can get away with throwing her under the bus." Then came the House leadership statement. "We take all allegations of ethical violations seriously and will allow the investigation to proceed without political interference." Translation: You're on your own. The next 48 hours were brutal. CNN, once her biggest cheerleader, started softening their coverage. Not a full pivot, not yet, but enough to give the Democratic establishment room to maneuver. Then, one by one, the party's top players started peeling away. The most damning moment? A senior Democratic senator, off the record of course, told a reporter that the situation was deeply concerning and should be fully investigated. AOC fired back, calling it a betrayal by the establishment that has always sought to undermine progressive leadership. Shaw almost felt bad for her, almost, because she had gone from "this is fake news" to "this is a political hit job" to "this is proof the Democratic Party is corrupt" in less than a week. By the time the second senator made a non-committal remark about waiting for all the facts to come out, the writing was on the wall. The party wasn't defending her anymore, they were distancing themselves. And in Washington, that was just another way of saying the end was near. The Democratic Party had a long and storied tradition of throwing its problem children overboard the moment they became a liability. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, once their prized progressive warrior, was now sinking fast. And Ted Cruz? He had the metaphorical anvil ready to send her straight to the bottom. The Senate chamber was packed, not because people didn't know what was coming, but because they wanted to watch it happen in real time. Cruz took his time walking to the podium with the confidence of a man who had just been handed the easiest political win of his career. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and let the weight of the moment settle before delivering his opening salvo. "Mr. President, today this chamber must answer a question that will define whether we are a nation of laws or a nation of hypocrisy." A measured pause. For years, we've been told by the left that no one is above the law. We've been subjected to endless lectures about integrity, fairness, and accountability. Yet today, we stand here confronting undeniable proof that one of their own has willfully, knowingly, and repeatedly broken federal law. Cruz turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the room. If this Congress refuses to act, if the Department of Justice refuses to prosecute, then let's be honest with the American people. The law doesn't apply to everyone. It only applies to those who don't belong to the right political club. The weight of that sentence hung in the air. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't just commit an error in judgment. She committed a premeditated violation of federal law. She knowingly hired an illegal immigrant, ignored warnings from her own advisors, and when the walls started closing in, she lied to the American public. His voice hardened. And now, as the evidence piles up, what do we see? Silence. Deflection. The same media outlets that spent years breathlessly investigating tax documents and phone calls are suddenly uninterested in a sitting congresswoman orchestrating a cover-up. A slight smirk. "Well, I say, enough." Cruz turned to the cameras, his voice cutting through the chamber like a scalpel. "This is not a political dispute. This is a criminal investigation, and the Department of Justice has two choices. Either it upholds the law as it was written, or it proves that law enforcement is nothing more than a tool for the politically connected." His tone grew sharper, more deliberate. If a Republican had done this, if a conservative member of this body had knowingly violated labor laws, misused government funds, and obstructed an investigation, what would have happened? Would the FBI be knocking down their door? Would we be watching a primetime CNN special on the threat to democracy? A brief pause. Then, his voice dropped slightly, heavier now. The American people are watching. They see the double standard. They see the corruption. And they will not accept it. Within hours, the pressure was unbearable. The Department of Justice, already under fire for its selective enforcement of the law, had no choice. AOC was officially under federal investigation. The charges: violating federal immigration and labor laws by employing an undocumented worker, misusing government funds to sustain her illegal operation, and obstructing a federal investigation by attempting to bury the evidence. For all the talk about protecting democracy, AOC had done a damn fine job of violating it herself. And just like that, the unstoppable progressive icon had become a cautionary tale. The fallout was swift, but the Republican Party wasn't about to let this moment go to waste. Donald Trump wasted zero time weighing in. "This is exactly what I've been saying for years. The Democrats pretend to be the party of law and order, but look at them. Corrupt cheaters, and now they got caught." Sad. Fox News ran wall-to-wall coverage, breaking down every lie, every contradiction, and every self-inflicted wound in AOC's unraveling career. Ben Shapiro went into full analytical mode, speed-talking his way through every blatant hypocrisy in AOC's public record. Tucker Carlson, he was practically grinning as he narrated her downfall like a Shakespearean tragedy, except, as he put it, with fewer poetic monologues and a lot more whining on Twitter. And Ted Cruz? He wasn't done. The message to America is clear. If you're politically connected, you can break the law and expect to walk away untouched. But we're not going to let that happen. We will not allow the Department of Justice to drag its feet. We will not allow the media to bury this story. And we will not allow the left to rewrite the rules in their favor yet again. A long, deliberate pause. The rule of law either applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. And if this body fails to act, history will remember this moment, not as a triumph of justice, but as the day Washington officially abandoned it. The chamber erupted, and just like that, the Republican Party had its biggest political win of the decade. With AOC's collapse, the border crisis was back in the spotlight. The GOP pushed forward tougher immigration laws, and America had just witnessed one of the greatest political implosions in modern history. And Shaw, he sat in the back of a DC bar, swirling the last inch of whiskey in his glass, watching the headlines roll across the screen like the end credits of a bad movie. It was done, or at least that's what they wanted him to believe. Because something wasn't adding up. AOC had been reckless, sure, but she wasn't a fool. She had been untouchable for years, a progressive firebrand backed by billion-dollar donor networks, activist groups, and the very machine that had propelled her from bartender to congresswoman. So why had they let her fall? Why had her own party treated her like a defective product, tossing her aside without so much as a fight? Shaw pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes, the pieces rearranging themselves in his mind. The moment the scandal had broken, the Democratic leadership had gone radio silent. The same people who had defended AOC through every misstep, every controversy, every outrageous policy proposal, had suddenly lost her number. No coordinated damage control. No deflections. Just silence. It wasn't self-preservation, it was strategy. They had known. Not just about the scandal, about the timing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just one woman's downfall. It was a move on the chessboard. Shaw exhaled slowly, shutting off his phone. The bar around him buzzed with laughter, with half-drunk political aides celebrating the latest shakeup in Washington. But he wasn't celebrating. Because if there was one thing he knew, it was this: the real story never ended with the first fall. It was about who was waiting to take their place.